we are now in an era of digital colonialism and the use of what I think Sri Lanka was really a kind of test case in some sense, that what happened in 2022 with the Aragale regime change and default of a full spectrum dominance over the horizon operation where all systems were used. There was an embargo on oil and gas reading the country, so that this default could be staged. So there's new forms of, I suppose, warfare.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Darini Rajasingham-Senanayake. Darini earned her PhD from Princeton University and is now a social and medical anthropologist with research focus in international development and political economy. She's also a prolific writer in several online outlets and the politics of South Asia and especially her native Sri Lanka. She often points out the neo-colonial structures and the many regime change operations that have been economically and politically devastating her part of the Eurasian continent. This is what we want to discuss today. So, Darini, welcome.
Thank you, Pascal. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for taking the time. I had a couple of discussions about Sri Lanka and India in the past, but I was wondering if you could give me an update of the situation in Sri Lanka, because you also went through a regime change not too long ago, and you've got new people in power at the moment. What's happening in your country, and how are things developing?
Well, things are relatively calm. Some say it's the calm before the storm, as Sri Lanka is in US dollar Eurobond debt trap and has to start paying back the capital in a couple of years. And that's when, big amounts of money are going to be needed. And the country is expected to go into another economic crisis. But right now, things are fairly calm. Of course, there's sort of discussions about setting up a U.S. spaceport and maritime security hub in Sri Lanka at this time. As you know, it's a very geostrategically located country at the center of Indian Ocean trade, energy, and submarine data cable routes. And also about 50% or less than 50% of the global container traffic passes through the seas of Sri Lanka. So there's a lot of interest in it, and therefore there are simultaneous with the sort of economic crisis that happened in 2022, and after which Sri Lanka effectively lost its economic sovereignty to the IMF and the Washington Consensus. Now there's sort of discussions about a tripartite framework partnership of SpaceX and U.S. Space Force and the Sri Lanka Defense establishment to it's just talk right now, but talk often has at an official level had first satellite-based maritime surveillance systems to be set up in Sri Lanka. So as we know, there's been a long interest of the United States and the West to set up military bases in this country, given its geostrategic location. So this is all sort of happening as things seem relatively calm in the country right now. And everybody, of course, has been looking at what's happening in India and Pakistan, as it were, which are both nuclear-armed neighbors to Sri Lanka. And this happened with attacks in a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago in Kashmir, in the Pahalgam area, when 26 tourists were attacked by Islamist terrorists. And this was blamed on Pakistan, and these two nuclear-armed countries seem to be heading for another confrontation. Ironically, this these attacks happened just when the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and his Indian origin wife Usha Vance and their children were visiting India, and simultaneously Prime Minister Modi was visiting Saudi Arabia, which is where you have historically had some of the Wahhabi, Salafi, fundamentalist Islamist networks emanating from that have sort of been around. These networks of terror have originated in the Middle East and have also ravaged Sri Lanka. As you know, we had in 2019 our so-called ISIS claimed attacks on 7 tourist hotels and churches, which sort of destroyed the economy of this tourist-dependent country. And that was in 2019. But somehow the similarities of the attacks, because the Pahalgam attacks in Kashmir also focused on tourists and the economy of the Kashmir the parallels have not been sort of picked up in this. And it's just been glossed as a confrontation between Pakistan and India, whereas we've had these kinds of terror attacks in other parts of South Asia. And my sense at this time is that South Asia has increasingly been drawn into the new Cold War between the United States and China, which has also is most evident as a hybrid economic sort of proxy war in South Asia, in the South Asian region. So India and all of the South Asian countries more or less have been, as you said, through regime change operations in India is dealing with this Pakistan issue. But the whole region as a whole can be seen as a new regional proxy war site in the Cold War standoff between the United States and China.
Yeah, that is very worrisome.
At this time.
It's very worrisome to me. And I remember back in 2021, I wrote a short article in the Diplomat together with a Sri Lankan student of mine about at the time how Sri Lanka under the leadership of the Rajapaksas, one of your political dynasties, if I could put it that way, was trying to balance between these fronts, and actually the Rajapaksas were talking about Sri Lanka being a neutral country and being open to everybody, giving a port access to the Chinese, but also to the Japanese, and offering it to everybody. And that was 2021 and 2022. And then came riots. Can you maybe explain what happened also in the political shift after the Rajapaksa era, and where we are standing today in your internal politics?
Yes, well, Sri Lanka has long tried to have a neutral foreign policy. It was one of the founder members of the non-aligned movement. They played a very strong role under the first woman prime minister of the world, Sirimavo Bandaranaike at the time. And there has been this commitment to be non-aligned and neutral throughout, but there are always external power plays happening through politics in the country. And so what happened in 2022, and this was simultaneous to the regime change operation that was happening in Pakistan, where Prime Minister Imran Khan was ousted, and he was a very popular democratically elected prime minister who was also trying to forge a very non-aligned course for Pakistan at the time. And he was ousted, and he directly said that the Undersecretary for South and Central Asia, Donald Liu in Washington was involved in that operation. And of course, now Imran Khan is in jail, and we have this Shahbaz Sharif government, which is now, there's all these issues with India at this time.
And
And
may I just interject one thing? Because that undersecretary that you just mentioned, we have
yes,
records of him officially saying that the United States cannot accept Pakistan's aggressive neutrality. He actually spoke of aggressive neutrality,
oh,
uh,
really?
or hostile neutrality. I forgot, but he used that and he said that's not acceptable to the United States. To
Yeah.
the then ambassador to Sri Lanka back there, that very guy, and then. And then a regime change happened. And in Sri Lanka too, you had the Rajapaksas were ousted from power.
Yeah, so this was very simultaneously in the spring summer of 2022. Um, what was happening in Pakistan and in Sri Lanka, we had this USAID, NED, and Soros Foundation funded Aragalaya protest, which was an outpouring of civil society, apparently, and NGOs, funded NGOs, protesting against the Rajapaksa regime, which was unpopular, and it because of enormous amounts of nepotism and corruption. But at the same time, they had been democratically elected. And so we had this sort of regime change operation happen to bring in Ranil Wickremesinghe, who had lost his seat, by the way, at the previous elections, as the new president to supposedly save Sri Lanka from the Rajapaksas, etc. So we had simultaneously a regime change operation amidst these staged protests, the Aragalaya. And of course, there was, a lot of, one of the reasons I think as a social scientist, I would say for the Aragalaya and this outpouring of protests was also, it was in the immediate wake of 2 years of economically devastating COVID-19 lockdowns. These protesters never ever came out to protest the lockdowns. And then suddenly you had them all over having this extended beach party on the beachfront at Golfes Green and protesting with, against the regime. So it was kind of interesting to note that. But in any case, so we have the regime change, we have this claims that Sri Lanka is bankrupt, and we have then the narrative that Sri Lanka has to go into default. And this is where I really have sort of questioned the narrative, because if you look at the rest of South Asia, and I'm just back actually from India, Delhi, and I was also in Varanasi. Um, Sri Lanka is by far the wealthiest country of South Asia in real terms. That is by all metrics, whether it's in terms of purchasing power parity, GDP per capita, social development, human development, physical quality of life index, infrastructure, whatever, except for Maldives, which is really tiny. And so the question then is, how can Sri Lanka be bankrupt and the rest of South Asia, which is actually poorer in real terms, be not bankrupt? And it comes down to the narrative that Sri Lanka doesn't have exorbitantly privileged US dollars, and therefore it's bankrupt. But the question then is the US dollar an adequate measure of the wealth of nations? And this really is really one of the core questions that I think the world needs to grapple with at this time, when there are 56 other global South countries caught in these international sovereign bond debt traps. But in any case, so that's a narrative that we have to challenge. And also what appears retrospectively to have happened is that what we might consider to be an illiquidity crisis was claimed to be an insolvency and extended. And this happened with probably because Sri Lanka is a small country and it's geostrategic, through a whole series of external and internal geopolitical activities, such as, and there was also lawfare, the use of law as a form of to crash the economy. So the shadowy Hamilton Reserve Bank in St. Kitts and Nevis took out a court case in New York against the government of Sri Lanka for not paying a small amount of interest. And then there were rating agencies coordinated, Moody's and Fitch, etc., downgraded the currency. And so there was a run on the rupee, and it depreciated overnight. So there was all these sort of external activities against the currency, and then there was the internal chaos operation of the Aragale protests and the regime change, and then a president who came into power, Ranil Wickremesinghe, who came into power claiming that Sri Lanka, which is a tropical country that's blessed with Mother Nature's largest. We have 2 monsoons, plenty of sun and rain, and have always been, sort of more or less able to produce the food that we eat, claiming that there's going to be a famine in this country and there's going to be 15-hour power cuts and sort of this whole fear psychosis narrative to promote the story that Sri Lanka is bankrupt and must go to the IMF, and that there is no alternative to the IMF. Now, at the time of the default, China was blamed in all the press and corporate media and the legacy press for Sri Lanka's debt trap. But since we have analyzed the profile of Sri Lanka's debt, it's very clear that private creditors, international sovereign bond traders and private creditors and hedge funds and BlackRock is the largest creditor, are really the cause of Sri Lanka's odious debt crisis. And at the time, back in 2021, about 180 actually international economists, including Yanis Varoufakis, Jati Ghosh, Dani Roddick, Thomas Piketty signed a letter to the IMF saying that there should be cancellation of Sri Lanka's odious debt, which is the private creditor debt, which are, because they're predatory in nature, they charge very high interest rates, citing risk. And when the risk matures, they should walk. They can't then go to the IMF and ask for payback when they have already made a lot of money on very high interest rates. But the entire IMF debt restructure in Sri Lanka that has just concluded is really privileges payments back to these international sovereign bond holders. And it sets up the country, as many have pointed out, for a second default, because not only has the currency depreciated 100% from what it was, so we have, and the currency, and it has to be paid up in US dollars, but also, and the country's been asked to go into austerity, to highly taxed, sell off its strategic infrastructure, etc., which is really going to, cause another crisis and diminish growth. So this is a recipe for disaster. This is why I said we are sort of in the period of the calm before the storm to come because of IMF, and there is no alternative to the IMF, the narrative that has been spread in the country at this time.
This is absolutely sick, because telling a country that is indebted in a foreign currency and that's indebted in US dollar to go to the IMF to get more US dollars in exchange for, promises of paying back more in the future is like telling a heroin addict to go to a heroin dealer to get more heroin that he then has to somehow give back in the future. It's insane because that's what happened to Greece. That's exactly what they did to Greece. And they punished Greece beyond, I mean, worse than they punished the Germans after the Second World War.
Oh,
And Greece has been bled dry. And even Christine Lagarde, at the time the head of the IMF, admitted, according to Yanis Varoufakis, admitted that there's no way that Greece will ever be able to pay back those US dollar denominated loans that they're getting. As long as you get a loan in USD and you have to pay back more than you get, you're in a trap. And, uh, so the horrible thing is, of course, that the leverage that they have is that if this is not being paid back by Sri Lanka, then Moody's and Finch are going to downgrade your sovereign bonds to trash status, and then there will be no refinancing of Sri Lanka in the private market, right? And from nowhere, and you need a couple of USD in order to pay USD denominated invoices coming from service providers from around the world, right? So that's the trick, and that's the catch. My question is why is Sri Lanka not why is it not possible for Sri Lanka to use somebody else but the IMF? Let's say, for instance, we know that China sits on a mountain of US dollars. If the Sri Lankan central bank and the Chinese central bank agreed on a currency swap for them to give you some of their foreign currency, some of their USD in exchange for Sri Lankan rupees, which might not be that useful to the Chinese, but you can try to actually ask them. If that was possible, you would have a different source. Why is it that the IMF is framed as the only possible source of USD for the country?
um, well, I suppose there was really at the time even of the default, there was Chinese yuan in the bank, as it were, but there were conditionalities about a minimum amount to be retained and conditionalities for its use. And I think there's a sort of gap, in some sense, in between the sort of rhetoric that the BRICS is sort of putting out in some sense of, alternatives to the US dollar system, etc., and actually enabling debt-trapped countries of the global south to access other trade and do currency swaps, etc. I think, but on a larger note, we do say that we have to de-dollarize, to decolonize, and in the long run, the country needs to be looking to other markets and trading in a multiplicity of currencies, which is what is already happening to get to go beyond the sort of hegemony of the US dollar. But there seems to be at this point in the global system itself, as much as everyone feels that there's a need for a new development in financial architecture for reform of the current system, there has to be a coming together of all these debt-trapped countries of the global south, in a sense, to call for a way not only of debt cancellation, but also for alternatives to the US dollar regime.
Right. I mean, the US dollar regime and the dependence on this currency that you do not control is, of course, the source of much of this suffering, and the IMF is just there in order to reinforce that system, not to ameliorate the entire thing. Because if you give away your strategic assets, and I'm pretty sure the IMF is looking at privatization under BlackRock and so on
Absolutely.
of your ports and your cables and your energy infrastructure, those are the things that then BlackRock and so on will buy up, and there you go. And the tragedy, the hypocrisy is that while they do that, they point at China, claiming that China is using debt trap politics. death trap
Mm.
politics, and they use a
Mm.
port in Sri Lanka as a proof of that, which
Right.
is it's
Right. Yeah.
sick.
Yeah.
It's absolutely sick. But
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
is the current government or is the current political configuration in Sri Lanka? Is there somebody who works against this and who says like, guys, this is insane. We cannot do this. Or your current president is called Disanayake, right?
Yes, that's right.
What,
Yes, this
where's
one.
he standing? Like, what is his role?
So it's kind of ironic because so after the regime change, we had President Vikramasinghe, who sort of pursued this narrative of there's no alternative to the IMF, and then people were fed up of that. And the current regime, the National People's Party is NPP is supposed to be a sort of leftist outfit, though some of us call it post-leftist or post-Marxist outfit. And but he had accused this President Disnaika had accused Ranil Wickremesinghe of a lot of corruption, which is demonstrably the case. That there were all these bond scams at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka when Ranil Wickremesinghe was finance minister and later prime minister. So, but then he jumps as soon as they came into power. The new People's Alliance party came into power. They ran and signed onto the same IMF agreements that the previous corrupt regime had negotiated, rather than saying, look, we can't go sign these agreements without doing due diligence. There is such a concept as due diligence. A popularly elected new government has to tell the bondholders and the IMF and everybody else who are waiting for their payback that they need to do due diligence on these agreements made by the bondholders who are essentially the contributors and the supply side of odious or corrupt debt, which is transacted by corrupt local politicians. But it seems that they are in the way we talk about this debt crisis, there were only corrupt local politicians, but there weren't who were the demand side of odious debt, but there wasn't a supply side of odious debt. But there is a supply side, and that is the international bond international financial system that and the private creditors and the Black Rocks, etc., who charge lend to corrupt governments, knowing full well that these are problematic governments, and the funds go into the pockets of people rather than go into development projects, unlike the bilateral and multilateral aid, which is relatively more transparent and can be tracked, where the loans taken for these from bilateral and multilateral lenders. So this is really one of the big issues that we are facing at this time, as to what is to be done about ensuring that there is debt cancellation of this odious debt, rather than paying back the private creditors. And if you look, really, it's quite shocking. The whole IMF, it's called the IMF and the debt restructuring under the extended EFF, extended fund facility. They sort of give a loan, a small loan, and then you have to do all these negotiations with the bondholders, with bilateral lenders and multilateral lenders. And it's turned into kind of rocket science, because, I mean, debt is not such a big, imponderable issue, but it has been turned into this very complex rabbit hole of corruption. So it's very untransparent. We don't know the names of the private creditors, the bondholders who stand to benefit from the new debt restructure. We, at least when it comes to bilateral or multilateral loans, we know where the money came from, and where the payments are going to go back to. So this issue of odious debt really needs to be sort of put up front and center, and the role of the international hedge funds and predatory creditors needs to be, and what we ironically call the colonial club, the Paris, or the OECD countries, the Paris Club and the London Club of Bankers, they sort of control this whole debt negotiation process. And it needs to be looked at again also because in the case of Sri Lanka, now, as I told you, we are the wealthiest country of South Asia, and Sri Lanka back in 2019 was listed by the World Bank as an upper middle income country. So this suddenly then it becomes bankrupt. And because it was listed as an upper middle income country, it was forced to go to private creditors rather than borrow cheaply from multilateral or bilateral agencies, because the cheaper loans from them go to less developed countries. They're only available for less developed countries, right? So Sri Lanka was forced by that system to go to private creditors when the COVID disaster hit. And so the whole sort of system seems to be rigged. So, and now because it is now it's been downgraded to a low middle income country, I think, it has to pay the debt cancellation that less developed countries get. Sri Lanka doesn't get. We need to pay the private creditors in full. And so you're sort of doubly penalized for being a middle income country. And this is all the new strategy of the IMF. And I think in the long run, they've also tied the new debt restructure is about ESG, economy, social and governance bonds, and the green bonds and blue bonds and pink bonds. And it's all this is macroeconomy linked. So if the economy does well, then the country has to pay much more to to the private creditors. And so this is a whole new system that they're trialing in Sri Lanka for middle income countries. And I think in the long run, this is all intended to buttress the US dollar at some level, because there are concerns that the dollar may be on a downward trend given the rise of the BRICS and the tend towards de-dollarization and trading in other currencies, etc. And that's one aspect of it at any rate. But to penalize middle-income countries or countries that are emerging economies get them to pay much more to private predatory lenders is really an issue of, I mean, it raises the question of moral hazard for the IMF. And as those economists who signed that letter said, it's unjust. It has no moral basis to be asking.
Yeah, but again, like asking for a moral basis or for morals in the IMF is a bit like asking for morals in hell. It's like it's not set up for that. It has obviously a different purpose. The question is whether there are alternative methods to get around the systematic trap that was set up. So why is it that the new development bank, the BRICS development bank, is not a potential lender of last resort to Sri Lanka?
Well, I think there's different kinds of constraints on that. On the one hand, the whole Sri Lankan culture itself is very Euro and Western-centric. It's the colonial mentality, if one might say, put it rather bluntly, or the colonial hangover. So Sri Lanka has hesitated to apply to BRICS and the NDB, etc. And even the current regime sort of, there was an invitation to the meeting in Kazan where all the BRICS, the heads of state met last year, but this government didn't just sent a sort of low delegation rather than the president or the prime minister attending. So the reach out of Sri Lanka to the BRICS and to the New Development Bank has been rather meager.
Timid.
And on the other hand, um, I think the sort of BRICS and of course China is treading very softly because of this whole sort of regional geopolitical configuration. And of course, there's India, who is Sri Lanka's big brother in some sense, and with all its sensitivities and its new alliances with the US also there. So Sri Lanka is in a sense caught in this three-way geopolitical standoff between the United States, China, and India, and sort of trying to steer a middle path, a neutral path, a non-aligned path, because that's sort of somehow in the DNA of the population, it seems. We don't have any military bases, of course, because if you look at the map of the Indian Ocean world, where Sri Lanka sits dead center, there's enormous, it's ringed with military bases, but at the center, because India never tolerated US bases, there's very few, right? But on to the west, in West Asia and the whole of the West Asia and the whole of East and South China Sea, etc., is ringed with US military bases. So and they're very keen to get one in Sri Lanka. It'll be interesting to see going forward whether now India is going to tolerate US base, because during the Cold War, India was very much allied with Russia and the Soviet Union, as it were, the communist bloc, and dead set against the United States or the former colonial power Britain having a base in Sri Lanka. And that was, in a sense, the raison d'etre of the so-called ethnic internal conflict that happened, which was really a proxy war between India, then allied with Russia and the Soviet Union, backing the liberation tigers in the north, and also to protect the Trincomalee base, which is this deep sea port that everybody wants. And in the south, we had a pro-Western regime backed, which India feared would enable the United States and Britain to have a base, a military base. So we had so the Tamils were, and the LTT was backed, the terrorist group was backed by India in the north, and the Sri Lankan military was supported by Mossad, and trained by the Israeli Mossad, which was a front for the United States, working out of the U.S. embassy at the time, because Sri Lanka had not acknowledged the existence of Israel, because being very pro Palestine during its non-aligned course. And of course, the British MI6 and the Keeny-Meeny KMS mercenary group all trained the Sri Lankan military. And then we had this kind of dirty war scenario unfold. And the Sri Lankan military was accused of war crimes. They were all trained, and this whole dirty war operation was, in a sense, set up by these external actors who were then, engaged in this proxy war with the Indian-backed LTT, Liberation Terms of That. And so there's been this sort of regional proxy war that happened in South Asia in the previous Cold War. And now I think South Asia is again on the verge of another regional proxy war with various different inflections in the different countries, given different internal configurations of religion and ethnicity and all of that. But you can see the trends with, there was also the regime change that happened in Bangladesh last year when Sheikh Hasina was gotten rid of, replaced, and she's now in Delhi, and replaced by Muhammad Yunus in a similar operation. So there's been a lot of turbulence in the neighborhood, and this is all related to a new Cold War, with South Asia becoming the focus also because it's at the center of the Indian Ocean world, which is the crossroads of global energy and cyber and undersea submarine data cables, etc.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with your analysis, because the question is if Sri Lanka can maintain a neutral course or whether it will be co-opted by one or the other side. And at the moment, it looks as if the co-option is coming straight from the West, which, the West has a very, very, very poor track record of accepting neutral countries. Ukraine would be neutral if it wasn't for the West. And they rather had a proxy war there or an implementation war there than letting it be a buffer the way it should be, or letting Sri Lanka be a buffer. And currently, this is being undermined systematically by the IMF. So the question is, the countries that do not accept neutrals on the map is currently first and foremost the United States. Maybe under Donald Trump this is changing, but we don't have an indication, a very strong indication for that yet. India. Would India accept a neutral Sri Lanka, or is India also trying to, meddle in Sri Lankan affairs in a way that de facto it controls its ports and its infrastructure, at least when it comes to like military hard power capabilities of who gets to land there, who doesn't?
Yeah, absolutely. India has always considered Sri Lanka its backyard and its security, intrinsic to its security. Yeah, so India would realize that, like ASEAN, a country can only develop insofar as the whole region develops economically. And India wants to be an economic powerhouse, but you can't be an economic powerhouse by beggaring your neighbors, as it were, or capitalizing on the disasters that your neighbors face. And that's what happened with the regime change, Aragalaya, and default that Sri Lanka had in 2019 that was staged. India sort of capitalized on it and has been very much involved with the Paris Club negotiations and supported the IMF narrative rather than challenging it and saying, look, Sri Lanka was the richest country in South Asia. How did this all happen? But India's Adani has profited from the privatization push of the IMF. So Adani is also a partner of BlackRock, and they have bought into the Colombo port and various so-called green energy projects in strategic coastal areas in Trincomalee and then in Mannar, which are these strategic coastal areas. So Adani is, and which is close to BlackRock and India and also to Prime Minister Modi itself. So it has been sort of profiting from the sort of economic crisis the staged economic crisis in Sri Lanka. And if you see what's going on in relation to Pahalgam Kashmir problem that happened, India has withheld the river water from and is not is so it's basically kind of economic warfare on Pakistan to and its poor people, the farmers, who will be deprived of Indus water as a sort of punishment um, for these terror attacks, which are, obviously, also staged. So, um, can the question that I think India may, foreign establishment may want to ask itself is can you sort of profit from your neighbor's pain, and can you develop as a country if the rest of your region is being impoverished, and everyone actually, including India, is caught in this standoff between and the turbulence between the US and China. But I think all of this is related to the larger global power shift that's now happening from the global north to the global south, from the west to the east. This is, as we know, the Asian 21st century. Asia is now again, as it was for most of human civilization, actually. Asia was the center of the world. Most of the innovation, the technology, the great world religions, everything came from Asia. And the West, led the world for the last couple of centuries, but now the power is moving back. And as many um, world systems historians and theorists have talked about. And so all that's going on, I see in South Asia at this time as part of the larger turbulence related to this global power shift from the West to the East, and the attempt of the West to sort of claw back its power and privileges and all of that. But the train has left the station, as far as I can tell. Structurally, I mean, at this time, it still seems that that the West may be quite hegemonic, but if you look at the big power centers, the economic growth hubs, the populations of Asia, it's obvious that that the wheels are turning in this direction. So we have to weather the storm, as it were, for the next 10 years, I don't know, or 5 years, until things, come back to some reality. But there's also all this issue of cyber war and digital colonialism. We are now in an era of digital colonialism, and the use of what I think Sri Lanka was really a kind of test case in some sense, that what happened in 2022 with the Aragale regime change and default of a full spectrum dominance over the horizon operation, where all systems were used. There was an embargo on oil and gas reading the country, so that this default could be staged. So there's new forms of, I suppose, warfare, and also that was demonstrated in what actually happened between Pakistan and India, the supposed shooting down of these Rafale advanced fighter jets by Pakistan, and there's a lot of discussion about the new military operations with cyber and new systems, as it were. So we are in an age of the digital economy, the digital surveillance, and the new battleground is that to control populations. So we will see what happens in future.
Yeah, and one thing is sure, like the West is not going to give up on its attempts to
Yeah.
force its way down the throats of everybody else, because they don't know anything else. The last 500 years has been nothing else but coercing others into doing the bidding, either directly with weapons or indirectly with shenanigans. Um, Darini, thank you for this overview. People who want to read your analysis, where should they go? Where do you publish your articles, or do you have a place where you put your analysis?
Well, I put my analysis on various websites, but I don't really have a Substack or any particular. I suppose one could do a Google search, but a lot of the stuff that I write is also kind of hidden away because Google itself doesn't is part of that whole
Yeah.
operation, as it were, to of gaming the narrative. But yeah, I need to do work more on that in the
I
future.
Okay, everybody, Google Darini, and you will find her writings. And once she starts a Substack, I'll let you all know. So, Darini, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal. Good to talk to you.